Well, I'd like to begin just to thank you for coming on to our show and taking your time on this really sunny Friday to be inside and talk to us. As you can see, I'm talking to you from my bedroom. And so this is a new format, let's say during COVID times, which is appropriate given your research. I wanted to just start, we know that you're an economist and you're interested in labor economics, but if you could just tell us a bit about yourself to begin.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I just joined the faculty a couple of years ago. I am, as you said, interested in labor economics, and in particular, I am interested in different dimensions of inequality. So most of my research analyzes different causes and consequences of inequalities across different groups of people, be it gender inequalities, racial inequalities. And during this time, I guess, it was natural to think about not only gender inequality in terms of production of research, but also seniority inequality. So this is essentially kind of what pushed me or what drew my attention to this project.
Recently, you and your colleagues have published a really interesting paper on female economists and production of new research during the COVID-19 period. Could you tell us a little bit about this paper and some of the key findings, please?
Yes, sure. So the idea for this paper came about really from the sheer shock of the contrast between our unproductive days of adjusting to a lockdown and, being constantly worried about our families abroad, trying to organize food shopping, either online or offline, rescheduling meetings, canceling seminars, canceling work trips. And for the two of the co-authors who are mothers, also spending endless hours homeschooling and so on, while at the same time, seeing our Twitter and our emails being flooded with more and more new working papers on COVID-19. And so we started to wonder, who are these people? I mean, we were barely coping with our lives, and there were economists producing COVID paper after paper after paper. And so my co-authors and I decided to take this shock/frustration and try to turn that into a research project. And by the way, I just wanted to say that my co-authors, Elisa Faraglia, Chryssi, Giannitsarou, Zeina, Hasna, and I are all equal contributors. In economics, we're cited in alphabetical order, so I am very lucky to have a last name starting with an A, but I am just 1/4 of the team. And the four of us together essentially took all these new working paper titles that were flooding our email inboxes and turned that into a data set that we could study. And then the Center of Economic Policy Research kindly complemented our data, importantly with some seniority information, and we put ourselves to work. So to get a sense of who's of the group of highly productive economists, we focused on working papers rather than published papers, because in economics, it takes a very long time to publish, and it is quite common to disseminate ongoing research through working papers, which have the structure of fully developed peer-reviewed papers that can report early-stage results. And so working papers seem like a natural way to measure contemporaneous productivity, and this is what we are interested in. And then on top of that, we focused on COVID-related working papers, because COVID is a brand new research topic in economics. And so anyone working on COVID in the first few months of the pandemic should have gotten the project started and also moving at a fast pace around the same time that the pandemic lockdowns were being introduced, for us to see this as working papers around March or April. And so this is the research output that we really want to measure. And these working papers, by the way, for full disclosure of the data, come from the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Center of Economic Policy Research. And we have this since 2015 for the same 4-month period, January to April, for our comparisons, essentially to avoid any seasonality that there may be in terms of the research output of economists. And in a nutshell, what we do with these working papers is classify their titles into COVID-related and unrelated titles. And we assign a gender to each author contribute to these working papers using their first names. And for those first names that were not easy to classify into male or female, which are unfortunately many of them, we manually looked at the author and assigned the gender. And what we find with this data is, first, that our impression that there were more working papers than ever was actually correct. There was a 30% increase in working papers as compared to the average in the same 4-month period in the previous 5 years. And more interestingly, perhaps, that even though women's contributions to non-COVID research earlier this year was comparable to the previous 5 years, it remained stable at about 21%. Women contributed much less to COVID-related research. There were only 12% of women authors contributing to COVID-related research. And then, of course, we wanted to know more about who these 12% of women authors were. And so in order to dig deeper here, we used the seniority information that we had for one of our outlets. This outlet contains summaries and op-eds about ongoing research in economics called VOXeu columns, which are typically associated with a working paper in any case, so they still measure contemporaneous productivity, but it's a slightly different output from the rest that we analyze, and so we work with this separately. And what we do with this data is split authors into 4 groups. So we have first the PhD and postdoc group, second the junior group, which includes recently appointed economists that are recently appointed assistant professors, lecturers, consultants, and so on. Third, the mid-career group, consisting of more established economists. So these may be individuals that graduated from a PhD 6 to 12 years ago. And fourth and last, the senior group, which includes well-established economists. And we study how each of these groups is producing COVID-related and unrelated research. And the first of our findings is that all seniority groups actually increase their productivity, which is surprising, actually, given the conditions. But the majority of this boost in new research is mainly driven by senior and junior economists. They really increase their productivity substantially around this period. And in contrast, mid-career researchers seem to be lagging behind. They seem to be actually producing at a similar level to the PhD or postdoc group, which are at the beginning of their research path. And because of that, they tend to produce at a much slower pace than mid-career researchers. So this is really kind of a stark result. And then once we zoom into COVID-related research alone, we see that this topic is being taken up mostly by senior economists and more so by men. In particular, even though juniors increase their productivity substantially by a stark 80%, among the 400 authors of VOXeu columns and among the 400 authors of VOXeu columns of COVID-related research, less than 30% were junior or mid-career economists, and of that 30%, less than a quarter were women. In fact, there were only 8 junior women and 13 mid-career women contributing to this research. And remember, COVID-unrelated research could have been started well before the onset of the pandemic, even years ago, and now it could simply be in the process of being polished and publicized. So with this in putting our findings together, our results seem to suggest that the productivity of women and mid-career economists in general has been disproportionately affected by lockdown measures, and the ones who are exploiting the very many new research questions arising from COVID-19 are mostly senior economists and more men than women.
Great, thank you for such a comprehensive summary of your article. I must say for the viewers and listeners that I found it personally very, very interesting. It's not a very long read, but it's a very, let's say, thorough evaluation of the situation, and it's entitled "Who is Doing New Research in the Time of COVID-19? Not the Female Economists." So really a strong title that really draws you in and carries you all the way through the article. So I really recommend those who are interested to read further. But just to pick up on some of the things you said, because the graphs that you include in the article are very clear and let's say can be accessed by non-experts and experts in this area. And what did strike me was this dip, like you said, for mid-career researchers. So could you go into maybe some underlying reasons for this? Often we see a graph and we see data and we take it as fact, but I'd really be interested in hearing, as you outline in the article as well, what are the reasons or the underlying mechanisms that might be driving this?
So Actually, for the moment, we still don't have the explanations for this. So our study so far is about statistics highlighting these facts. We do have our theories, and we're in the process of collecting more data in order to actually test our hypotheses, but in particular in terms of what may be harming mid-career economists. We think it could be that mid-career men and women, maybe the ones that are disproportionately dealing with childcare and homeschooling at the moment, right? And this may be causing their lagging behind in terms of research productivity. And this may be affecting, again, both men and women slightly more. The reason why it may be affecting women slightly more is probably a combination of several factors. I mean, what we think may be driving this, and again, these are just hypotheses that we need to test once we have the full data set, is a combination of a few factors. So first, women in general are more likely to be heavily involved in non-research related duties, administrative tasks such as organizing meetings and joining certain committees. And at the same time, they also to shoulder a higher share of childcare related work and home production, where by home production, I mean things like cooking, doing laundry, washing the dishes, and so on. And this first factor may explain why they are engaging a bit less than men, because in order to be working on a COVID-related project, they would have had to start the project around the same time than the pandemic lockdowns were being introduced. And that might be challenging because all of these burdens that women tend to carry the most were also exacerbated precisely because of the lockdowns. So that is the first factor. And then the second factor is that there are intrinsic differences in the way that men and women approach research. So women are on average more risk averse, and they may be less willing to start working on a topic which they know nothing about. They may also be less willing to, quote unquote, compete for new projects because, there is so much hype about COVID itself that it is very likely that a research question that you think about is already being tackled by someone else. So that makes COVID a riskier new topic than your own subfield of study. And then on top of that, women tend to produce fewer papers than men. So a 2018 study by Erin Hegel at the University of Liverpool, which I try not to think about most of the time, finds that women in economics face a trade-off between quantity and quality because unfortunately we are held to higher standards, which makes us spend more time on reviewing and polishing old research instead of generating new ideas. And so all of these factors may compound together and preclude women from investing in this new research area, and instead they may be spending their time completing work in progress, which, the bulk of the fixed cost of getting the project going was potentially paid before the pandemic started.
So you mentioned that you had an all-women list of authors, as in to say that you worked with women on this article, which is really impressive too, to see that you all worked together remotely and were able to produce this really incredible article. Did you, as a team, or depending on, I guess, the stage of the researcher, did you find any of these obstacles at play when you tried to work together remotely to produce this article?
Yes, definitely. I mean, half of the team are mothers of the ages that are in critical need of homeschooling. So all of our meetings were actually at 9 p.m. when their children were already in bed. And that was really taxing in the sense that was making us meet, for example, from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. And we had things to do at 11 p.m. in order for things to get going, right? So this really was, I guess, a bit of a bump in the road at the beginning. At the same time, working with them made me kind of realize that I was the only one struggling with feeling unproductive. So I lived by myself, and at the beginning of the lockdown, I was feeling, I don't know exactly how I was feeling, but just being alone all the time and just seeing people on the screen was just not doing it for me. I was also trying to work out via Zoom, and all of that was a little bit strange. And I have to say that interacting with my co-authors and seeing their struggles and having them listening to mine made me realize that, all of us were struggling, and, it was just in different ways and for different reasons, but, we were all in the same boat. And I really think working with them pushed me into a more productive path. I now feel great about working from home, I have to say.
Yeah, definitely. It gives you some perspective. It reminds me of an interview I heard with Sheryl Sandberg when she started working with Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, where she called him for a scheduled meeting at, I think, 9 p.m., so similar to what you were saying. And he was out at dinner with friends, and he said, Sheryl, I'll call you back at 11. And he called her back at 11 to have the meeting that they had planned to have. And she didn't pick up. She was sleeping. And then the next day he wrote a very worried text to her saying, Sheryl, were you unwell? Why were you sleeping at 11? And she wrote back and said, I'm a mother of two. I'm a working mother of two. I go to bed early because I have to wake up early. And so that really highlighted, the difference between the hours they keep, the hours available for productive work, both mentally and in terms of physically outputting written words on paper. And so it's interesting that you say the working hours also, make a difference to how many hours women have available to work.
Yeah, no, that's a really huge difference. And the other thing, for me, it was taxing to meet so late, I guess, because I am not as wide awake as during the rest of the day. But for example, their children, by the end of the project, the children of my co-authors were saying, no, please finish, because my mother is never paying attention to me anymore. It was really taxing for them. It was impressive. So I really admire my co-authors, and but it was great. I think it was great for the youngest of us, for Zeina, Hasna, and me to work with Chryssi and Elisa, in order to just push ourselves forward. It was really, really good.
Yeah, it seems like the research really hit home, quite literally.
Yeah.
I just wanted to maybe shift focus a little bit to looking at the future of research. So obviously COVID-related research, like you said, has a potential to be very impact-based. And I wonder what you think of as an economist in terms of a long-range projection. And again, this is just, informal conversation. It's not necessarily based on the article you wrote, but what could be some potential impacts of men doing more research on COVID impact than women, or men, primarily senior male researchers, prescribing policy prescriptions?
Well, I guess your question has two different angles. So on the one hand, in terms of the academics and the economists themselves, in terms of their careers, I think this will have long-term effects, because the pandemic to economists has given an unprecedented opportunity to study different economic and social implications of drastic policy measures that were unthinkable even a few months ago. And so those economists who are able to, in terms of time, and willing to, in terms of the risk associated with these topics, the uncertainty, are answering as many questions as they can. They are even taking questions that can be answered in a few years' time. Those are already being tackled. And so what this may mean in the long run for economists is that those who manage to, say, ride the COVID wave will have more publications, or at least visibility, than those who didn't, because brand new research questions, as you know, are typically hard to come by. But I guess the other dimension that may be relevant about mostly men tackling these policy questions is that we know that humans, we tend to be very biased towards our own experiences. And if we have only a certain group of people, and in particular senior male economists, doing all the policy analysis and policy prescription regarding COVID, we may not have as an inclusive range of policies as we actually need, right? So one of the most important populations that are being affected, and we can even see it among economists, is mothers. And if we don't have any mothers doing or participating heavily in all of these policy prescriptions, we may actually do, or not do, but do recommendations that are not helpful for them, that could be damaging for them. So I think that's the other dimension in which we should really consider the downsides of not having everyone involved. But, you know, for now, there's really nothing we can do, I think. All we can do, I guess, is try and incorporate more people into research teams as time goes by.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I thought we could just finish up with some questions that young researchers who are listening or watching this might have for you. And I think at the top of their minds, it would be, you know, any advice or any guidance on how to navigate their research during COVID-19 and beyond?
Well, you know, being a researcher struggling with the pandemic myself, I find it kind of hard to give advice to others. But one of the things I learned from working on this paper with my co-authors, as mentioned, is that many of us are struggling in different ways and for different reasons, but each of these ways and reasons that are undermining our ability to focus and to stay productive are valid ones. From the increased burden to parents, to the higher freezes that are in place in so many universities, and the caring for families abroad, most of us are struggling with anxiety, with fear, and unfortunately also with grief. And so we need to be patient with ourselves. It is really hard to do that because social media and our email newsletters seem to suggest that absolutely everyone is being more productive than ever. But, you know, although they're incredibly productive economists and researchers in general, we need to try and remember that these researchers are the exception and not the norm. And I guess now that you mentioned that, that is also something to keep in mind regarding our results. The economists in our data are in fact a selected sample of quite productive economists. This is just because of the research outlets that we use for our analysis, which tend to favor more productive economists. And so the results that we have, to some extent, are emphasizing what's happening among higher productive economists than the average. And no one should feel bad because even if they belong to a seniority group, they are not producing as the individuals in our data.
Yeah, it can be quite overwhelming to see how many young researchers in your article are producing at a very high rate. It shows a great flexibility as well of response, seeing this happening in the world around us and then responding, like you said, either having somehow pre-prepared research that is now applicable or being very agile and flexible. So that I think will be very comforting for those who are out there trying to do their best. Maybe we could just finish up with a last question. Many of our audience is still in secondary school or very early in their academic careers. Some are even considering, you know, what university to attend and how to pick a subject. And I wondered if you had any advice specifically for undergraduate students, since you yourself are a role model. You're a young economist who's done so well, and we're really honored to have you on this show. So just wondered if you had any advice specifically to those who are thinking about becoming economists.
Well, first, thank you so much for so many compliments. I don't think I personally should be a role model, but let me get to the answer of your question. So I think all professions are being hindered right now, even those that are in high demand. But I think that even in the current situation, economics is a great field of study if you are interested in doing either research or policy work. And the reason for that is that to do either research or analyze policies, design policies, you really need to care about what you're studying. And economics is one of the very few disciplines that gives you the freedom to work in such diverse topics that you're bound to find one that makes you feel really passionate about. The pandemic is a great example of that. There are economics papers on the effectiveness of mask wearing. There are some using epidemiological models that propose alternative lockdown measures. There are papers looking into the perception of risk of contracting COVID-19 across different birth cohorts. And, you know, when your mind is being consumed by a problem, any problem with economic consequences, be it the pandemic or the hardline tactics being used against Black Lives Matter protesters, it is a real advantage to have the possibility of working on something related to that. I mean, related to what's giving you anxiety. And for example, in the case of my co-authors and I, on who are the people flooding our emails and our Twitter feed with new research on COVID every single day. And I guess beyond academia, even in normal times, there's a lot of demand for economists precisely because of the wide range of topics that we get to work with. And I probably would go as far as to say that perhaps now is the prime time to be an economist, because if you want to, you can really contribute to helping developing countries and vulnerable people weather through the COVID storm, which unfortunately seems to be here to stay for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love what you said about the applicability. What I've loved as a student of economics myself and of labor economics like yourself is the applicability. And in these days when unemployment is still an issue for many governments around the world, especially in developing countries, and when COVID-19 is threatening, let's say, the labor markets of all countries in the world, it really is, I think, a very dynamic time to be studying economics.
Yes, and say I have a sister doing inorganic chemistry, and a couple of months ago, she was telling me how frustrated she was, that she was constantly worried about COVID. She only wanted to read about COVID, and she had to go to the lab and work with these, solid materials that had nothing to do with anything, and probably at some point will help with technology. But it's something completely different, and her mind was somewhere else. And it's really, really fortunate that economics gives you the opportunity to work where your mind is. I mean, It's not easy, but you have the chance to do that, and that's really, really great.
Yeah, it's interesting that your response is so similar to that of Duflo and Banerjee when they were asked after they received the Nobel Prize for Economics this year, what is their advice for future economists? And they said, I think Banerjee said, do what you love and love what you do. And then I think Duflo said, get your hands dirty, get experience the world, go out into the world, especially in terms of development economics. And so I think that's a really nice way to end our podcast. And I wondered if you had any last words or anything to leave our audience with.
Well, I guess only that, as you probably could tell from my underlying explanations for why we have these different patterns, this project is still not complete. So we're looking forward to complete this project in a few more months. So we want to have data all the way until March 2021 in order to draw our final conclusions, because things could change, the patterns of research could change. And I guess I just wanted to say, for anyone who's interested in this, please tune in a few more months to see what we find.
Yes, I personally will definitely be tuning in. I really enjoyed your article and talking to you about it, as well as just to really thank you for your research interest in this area and highlighting this as an area of interest and of research. Because I guess where research gets done, that's where interest follows. So by bringing this to light, this idea of female economists working during COVID is very, very timely and very, very necessary. So we thank you and your co-authors, like you said, it's a team effort for this research, and wish you all the best as you continue this research.
Thank you so much.